You're listening to the Cantina Cast, your home for thought-provoking Star Wars talk. Join Albert and Jonesy in breaking down the latest news, trailers, movies, and of course, your favorite characters from a galaxy far, far away.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Tales of the Cantina. My name is Albert Padilla, and tonight I'd like to share some personal thoughts and kind of reflect on a very important time in Star Wars fandom, which had a huge impact on me. The year was 1984. The video game industry of North America was still reeling from the crash of 83. Unemployment rates were at levels, hadn't been seen in decades before. And Steve Perry released his first album, Street Talk. It was the first steps in a move that would see him leave the band Journey just a few years later. And yes, I'm still pretty bitter about that one. But as a Star Wars fan in 84, hope was very much still alive. Return of the Jedi was completing its theatrical run and would go on to sell over 80 million tickets in the United States alone. And 84 was also the year that we'd get two very special Star Wars classics that we didn't know we deserved. The first was a movie called The Ewok Adventure, and later we would know that as Caravan of Courage. And the second, of course, was still one of the greatest and most important Star Wars animated shows we've had to date. And I'm talking about none other than the Muppet Babies on CBS. No, seriously, it was really important, and for good reason. Here's why. So picture yourself back in 1984. You're 11 years old. You're standing there with your parachute pants on. Your left arm has a freshly wrapped red bandana around your left wrist because you just saw it in an MTV music video. And more importantly, you were rocking a sweet Return of the Jedi iron-on shirt. You know, the one that hasn't really held up very well. It barely breathes, but man, it's got Vader on it. It's got Luke on there, and it has the Emperor on there, so you refuse to wear anything else. But even as an 11-year-old Star Wars fan in 84, there were some serious limitations that kind of prevented you from achieving your full potential. See, there was no internet. And without any internet, there was no YouTube. And with no YouTube, there was no videos. No internet, there was no StarWars.com. And there certainly was no way of watching any of the movies apart from owning a piece of technology that was just starting to make its way into homes called the VHS player. And even if you had access to a VHS player, you were still only limited to Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back. Return of the Jedi wouldn't be out for another 2 years on VHS. And let me just pause here because you heard it right. It was Star Wars back then. No one, and I do mean no one, referred to it as A New Hope. So what were you to do? How else were you going to get your fix for Star Wars during this time? Well, enter the Muppet Babies, and specifically an episode called Gonzo's Video Show. It was a bright light in a dark time, if you will, where we as Star Wars fans really didn't have much to hold on to. The episode kind of revolved around Gonzo being lent a VHS camcorder, and then with the help of the other Muppet Babies, he set out to make these home videos, which, the biggest one at the very end was kind of like a remake of Star Wars. And then throughout the episode, we got stills of stormtroopers from the movies. We had a clip at one point where the Millennium Falcon is making its way into the Death Star after it's being pulled by its tractor beam. We even got the main title screen, albeit it was set to some pretty sketchy version of the main title track. But seriously, that was it. And it was very important, which brings me to the topic of this episode of Tales of the Cantina. And I'm talking about a period of time that I affectionately refer to as the Dark Times, which by my account ran from about 1984 to 1991. And I refer to it as the Dark Times simply because in that span of about 7 years, new and existing Star Wars content was not only scarce at best, but it had nearly and completely dried up, which by today's standards of, on-demand television and the power and accessibility of the internet seems almost like nearly unimaginable that you would not be able to get anything at all like we can today. And sure, in 1985, we get the droids and we get the Ewoks cartoons, but droids ended after only one season. And Ewoks, it made it to a second season, but only to die shortly thereafter. So you could hardly call that a resurgence or a comeback of any sort. Sadly, all of this kind of just felt like the complete opposite. It felt like the proverbial nail in the coffin for a franchise that we were just too young to realize had defined our generation already. And so the dark times began, and with it came a period where Star Wars fans clamored and clung to every clip of footage that we could find, and we hung on every breath of Star Wars references and quotes that made it into other forms of media at that time. We had things like the gem of Marty McFly dressed as Darth Vader in 1985's Back to the Future. We got May the Force Be With You that same year in the movie Cocoon. We had Darth Ted and Luke Bill in 1989's Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. And then, of course, we had the main title theme from Star Wars itself playing in that Ferrari flying through the air scene in 1986's Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And there were there probably weren't a lot of others, but there were some more, but not many more. And as trivial and as insignificant as these things sound, they were monumentally important. They mattered because we really and literally didn't have anything else to go off of. The other 6 or 9 or 12 movies that were rumored to have existed somewhere in the the ether space of George Lucas's mind were merely figments of our own imagination. They were at best bedtime stories that we would tell ourselves to help us sleep at night. We didn't have new lines of toys or games, books, music, none of that. Even the information and rumors that were out there were really sketchy at best. They were simply, bits and bytes of information that we caught on local bulletin board systems on our Commodore 64s or our trash 80s late at night that we couldn't confirm or deny. And I suppose you can make an argument that denial is a form of hope, but still, apart from the BBS news, what else did we have? Bantha Tracks. Yeah, sure. Bantha Tracks. We had Bantha Tracks was the official newsletter for Star Wars, and it was in publication after 1984. But keep in mind that in 1987, Lucasfilm officially discontinued the newsletter, which for a 14-year-old at that time was the first sign of the looming apocalypse. The announcement of Bantha Tracks was being discontinued was as if a million voices suddenly cried out in terror and were suddenly silenced. That's kind of how it felt. So you can see we really didn't have much, save these kind of cool Star Wars references in the other movies and TV shows around this time. And even as cool as these were, as much as we coveted them, nothing stood up to a little-known movie from 1986 called Space Camp, starring Kate Capshaw, Leah Thompson, Kelly Preston, Tom Skerritt, Larry B. Scott, and an up-and-coming actor by the name of Leif Phoenix. Now, Leif was the brother of River Phoenix, and he would later take on his given birth name, which we all know him today as Joaquin Phoenix. In the movie Space Camp, Leif Phoenix played a character named Max. He was the brilliant 12-year-old kid who manages to accidentally get jettisoned into space aboard the space shuttle after his droid companion Jinx, fulfills his wishes. And as crazy as that sounds, it's a really good movie. But what's important to note here was that Max was a character obsessed with Star Wars. And honestly, the whole movie is actually full of Star Wars references and quotes, with the only other movie that I can think of that even holds a candle up to it, at least in this time frame, is probably Spaceballs, but that's a story for another time. Max was the poster child for all of us young and budding Star Wars fans during the dark times. He was an outcast. He was a nerd. He was a geek. He spoke in Star Wars quotes and verbal memes that were way ahead of their time, and he was mocked and ridiculed because of all of it. Like many of us, he was the everyman for a franchise that seemed to have all but left him, kind of left us in the dark, so to speak. And then in 1987, Star Wars fandom received a new hope, if you will, all over again. Something that not only would help spur our imaginations and our theories and speculation and interest in Star Wars again, but more importantly, it brought Star Wars fans together in a way that many of us were already kind of familiar with. And I'm talking about Star Wars, the tabletop role-playing game by West End Games. The game was fast. It was fun. It was very simple to play. You had 6-sided dice. You didn't need any of the other kind that were out there for Dungeons and Dragons and the other role-playing games. All you needed was this plain 6-sided dice to play with, and it made you feel like you were part of an infinite number of Star Wars sequels that would never come out. This game did more for the Star Wars community and fandom than anything after the original movies, and arguably even more than the movies themselves, because it's how it pulled all of the fans together again. With every source book release and every module and every expansion set, we got more and more informations and more answers to the questions that many of us held in our head as head canon. Things like, what were the 3 aspects of the Force that one had to master in order to become a student? Or what did Yoda really mean when he said that the dark side was quicker, more seductive? Or what did the interior of the Millennium Falcon really look like? And I'm not talking about just pictures here. We're talking like full color poster, full spread build diagrams that if I had the time and I had the money, the resources, and a pair of alluvial dampers, you can bet there was going to be a full-size Millennium Falcon going down somewhere soon. What we read from Saturday nights as we sat around the table and played this game was not just simply a set of rules or another tabletop RPG. These were true tomes of knowledge, unearthed arcana that were lighting our darkest hours, right? They were literally the first steps in a larger world that we would know to become the expanded universe and later legends, but we didn't know it at the time. Now, fast forward a couple years, and things were starting to brighten up for Star Wars fans by about 1989. More and more people were coming out as fans, and though that's almost like something woke inside of them. For me personally, I was fortunate to have been working at a local theme park where every morning at 4 a.m., I'd get out of bed, and within the first hour, I was joining a crew of about 5 other young men, and we spent all our days in the summer sun here in Texas, scraping away old wax from bronze statues, which is, by definition, a mundane task if there ever was one. And yet, I remember that job fondly. Looking back, it was actually one of the greatest times in my life, and I was very fortunate to have found 5 friends that I didn't know at first in that small crew that had varying degrees of Star Wars experience and knowledge, and we were all fans. We never wasted a single moment, and we spent most of our time playing a Star Wars trivia game. And the rules were very simple. One person would start by asking one question, any question, and it could be from the movies or it could be from the role-playing game. If you got the answer correctly, you got to ask the next question. If no one answered your question correctly, you got to ask another. And every day, this became our daily duty. Whenever we weren't working, of course, we would try to commit to memory the smallest details, the most trivial, most insignificant facts from the movies and the game, in hopes of completely and utterly mentally destroying each other before the whistle blew at the end of the day. We had questions like, how many probe droids were released in the opening scene of Empire? Or what was the model of the starfighter used by the rebels before the X-Wing became the standard? Or what was the trash compactor number that Luke tells 3PO to shut down in Star Wars? To this day, I can recite from memory the opening crawl to Star Wars, and I have that little band of brothers from SeaWorld of Texas. I have the movies, and I have the West End role-playing game to thank because of that. It truly was the beginning of the end, because in just 2 years' time, in 1991, and for the record, these were 2 very, very long years still. I mean, it felt hopeless at times during those 2 years still. But in 1991, we would finally see the first steps of a Renaissance movement for Star Wars by way of Dark Horse's Dark Empire comic series and the incomparable Heir to the Empire. It was a novel by a very unassuming writer by the name of Timothy Zahn. And it should be noted that to help Zahn write these first few books, Lucasfilm pointed him to source materials from, yes, you guessed it, the West End Games RPG. These were very exciting times. Star Wars was alive again by this point. We had new content, we had new stories, new characters, new worlds to explore, we had new dots to connect. And we didn't really concern ourselves with what was canon and what was not. I mean, heck, we didn't even know what canon was. That was still a few years away from 1991. It was like we got the band back together. We had Luke, we had Leia, Han, Chewie, Lando, R2, 3PO, some blue guy named Thrawn who probably wasn't going to make it out of the series alive. And yes, we even had new Jedi. And I'm looking at you, Mara, and I'm winking at you too. The dark times were finally over by this point. If peace and prosperity prevailed, and it was a really, really good time to be a Star Wars fan again. That period of my life from about 1984 to 1991, it taught me a lot about myself, about what I loved. It taught me a lot about what really mattered to me, and more importantly, what didn't. I learned to love Star Wars, and I learned to truly appreciate what little we had then. So much that in this day of Star Wars sequels and, anthology movies, TV shows, comic books, novels, video games, streaming services, and, in a time where some fans seem to become so disenfranchised and even toxic because of their own personal grievances with these stories, that it's really not hard to take all of this in for me, even the stuff that I don't agree with. It's not hard to take it all in and just appreciate how much fun all of this really is. And maybe that stuff, maybe the new stuff is just really that good. Maybe it's because I get to see Star Wars through the eyes of my own children these days. Or maybe it's because, I'm still that awkward kid in those parachute pants and Jedi t-shirt who's just a little bit wiser now and knows that there are simply not enough hours in a day, days in a year, years in our lives to be spent standing and waiting and hoping for dark times to end. And that's going to do it for this episode of Tales of the Cantina. I hope you guys really enjoyed it, and I hope to maybe hear your thoughts and feedback on it, especially if you went through the same period of time that I did, or even if you didn't, or maybe you went through some of this in your own personal fandoms outside of Star Wars. I'd love to hear back from you guys if that was the case. And I guess before I go, just don't forget, next week we'll be back with more Darth Vader comic book coverage. And after that, we're going to be revisiting The Last Jedi 1 year later. So until then, have a happy Thanksgiving to all of our listeners here in the U.S. And for everyone else, including those, we'll see you guys next week.
You're still listening? Wow, that's amazing. Well, I'm here to give you the disclaimer. Normally we do a big, long, drawn-out disclaimer thing saying what's what and who's what and all that other stuff, but I think you guys kind of know that Lucasfilm and Disney have no affiliation with us at all, and we have none with them. We talk about Star Wars, which is their property and all that other good, fun stuff, but I think you can tell which is our stuff and which is their stuff. If you can't, well, then send a lawyer to send an email to me and I'll be glad to chat with them. Other than that, you know what's what, so that's your disclaimer.